This is the postmortem for my project submitted as part of the Game Art Methods course at SCAD. Um, Wanted to document this process in a video format as a way of just going through the process and kind of highlighting some of the tools and um, methods that I used in the process. Um, So in retrospect, for submitting the project, I definitely aim to continue working on my skills in all of these tools, and then without a doubt, further optimizing the workflow. I might take a short break from this particular project just as a chance to refresh my mind, but then also kind of approach it with a new perspective. Some of the thoughts that I've had as I was working on it definitely aim to expand the hero area and exploring some of the visual effects, and then hopefully even incorporating characters at some point. But something else that I've also thought about, considering some of my previous work in virtual reality, is seeing what this environment could look like in that VR environment. Um, uh, I really enjoyed this whole process. At the end, there's definitely a lot involved in just this portion here, but it really highlighted some of the intricacies and challenges, and gave me a chance to see um, what areas I could be really good at, what areas I really enjoyed, and then of course some of the areas in which I struggled a bit, and maybe I need to refine some of the skill sets for those areas. Just off the top of my head, the foliage assets were probably the most challenging for me, but I think considering they're such a significant part of the scene, definitely want to refine some of the skill set involved with that. So first, I wanted to highlight what I found to be probably the most critical elements, simply because they're the foundation of this whole production pipeline. It's the infrastructure, the files, and the processes. Um, I thought I'd started the course with a good organization system and process, but as I went through the course and learned new tools and new processes, definitely had to go back periodically and refine that. And so my organization system right now for this particular project kind of evolved, but I think it set a good precedent for future projects. Um, the one thing was optimization, and with the various tools that were being used, such as Maya, which I have open here, and some of the others that I'll showcase here shortly, Marmoset and then Unreal. Um, some of them are CPU intensive, others are graphics card intensive, and then others are in some form or fashion utilize both. And so what I found useful was to have the task manager, the Windows task manager open. I have it here in the bottom right corner just to keep track of what processes were being utilized at any given time. So right now I have a lot of stuff open as part of this documentation, but in the production, I would try to limit what I have open at any given time, simply because of the resources that were being used. Um, and There were times where the computer, the fans, and just the hardware would sound like it's a jet engine. But that was probably a good sign that the machine is running something pretty intensive. And so it would be worthwhile to check to make sure that maybe if Chrome or something else that isn't necessary is open, maybe close that. I guess there was always that fear that something, a particular process would crash. So the more you can dedicate resources for that tool, the better. Um, so it's definitely worth monitoring at any given time. Throughout this process, not once did any of my equipment or software crash. So I was very fortunate in that sense, although there were times that I did seem to push it. Um, saving periodically, whether it was in Maya or any other major production software, Substance, and in Unreal, definitely saving periodically. I think some of these, like Maya, has an automatic saving schedule, so you can take advantage of that, as well as in Unreal. It could be every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, or so forth. But that way, it's one less thing to kind of think about. Uh, the other thing too is kind of test small files, so gradually progress through it. So, like in this case here, this is one of the assets in Maya. I have several of them overlapped here, but although these are low poly, as the models get larger and larger, um, kind of testing out smaller model sizes first, and then saving, and then rendering. Maybe, I think Marmoset might be a more suitable example. So, rather than having so many different assets all in one scene, starting out with just one asset, applying materials, lighting, rendering, and so forth, and then just kind of moderating the amount of resources that you have, and then little by little adding more and more to the scene as necessary. Um, so with the production pipeline, as more and more assets were created, it became really important to keep this organization system well defined, um, because files could end up anywhere, and then keeping track of it, you want to kind of make sure that you know exactly where everything is at any given time, so you can go back and revise it as necessary. So moving content from one software to another, that's kind of the response to that organization system. And so in my production pipeline, I start out with Maya, developing the low poly models. And what I found was that Maya itself has a pretty good organization system in their projects. So here in the project window, this is a typical just default settings project setup. And within each project that you define, what I ended up doing was creating one for each major asset. And within each one, it has several folders that you can define, and you can redefine them as necessary. But this is just the default, and I found it to be a pretty good starting point for saving content. And in fact, I have it open here on the right hand side. This is the Maya folder organization system for the gate that I have open. And so I would basically develop the model here in the scenes folder, and then there would be source images for reference images. What are some of the other ones? Images would be some of the other tools I would be applying. So Marmoset data would be in its own folder. Painter, Substance Painter would be in its own. Maps that I generated for tests. And then finally, under assets, I have kind of like the finalized version. So these files here were the exports from Maya that would be read by Unreal, which I have here. This is the folder structure for the Unreal content. And then under assets, I have its own folder structure, and basically creating that connection between Unreal and Maya. And Unreal has a really great way of keeping track of source files. If I open up Unreal here, um, in the content browser, I created my own little bit of an organization system folder structure to keep track of the different kinds of assets. So I have one for foliage, one for hero assets, and one for structure. But what I found is that after you import the FBX file for an asset, at any time, if I made an update to that folder or that asset within Maya and exported a new FBX file, Unreal actually remembers where that FBX file came from. And so to refresh it, I found that you could just right click a particular asset and then re-import it. And by re-importing it, it says here in the tooltip, re-import the selected assets from the source file on disk. So it coordinates the source location. And so that was a really quick way of making an update in Maya, exporting it as a new FBX file with the same name, and then importing it in Unreal so that it would refresh in its folder structure. So that by itself became a really streamlined way of keeping track of the assets as they went from Maya all the way to Unreal. The other part too was the file naming structure. First few assets that I created, the naming structure was a little bit off here and there, just because it was a little bit difficult to try to identify what needed to be what. But later on, I made sure that tried to keep things consistent. I had to be really careful about the length of it. There were a few instances where some of the file names were getting really long, but I just tried to identify, okay, this is an asset, this is part of a structure or a wall, and then which particular element that was. And then again, whenever it brought into Unreal, it would kind of correlate that. So the file naming was really important. And then just keeping file names in a single location. So I would export, these would be the final ones. Whereas some of these other folder locations that I had, one for example, let's see here, under Marmoset, actually this one doesn't have any, but there were some assets where I would do a few tests here and there, so I would keep those FBX files separate so that I would know that everything within this assets folder is what's meant to go into the Unreal uh, environment. And there were just so many instances where files were, at least in the first few assets, there were so many FBX files for tests here and there in my trial and error processes that it's getting a little difficult to keep track of which one was the final version. So by the end, I made sure that I isolated those pieces and then left the test FBX file somewhere else. Version control, that was another part that was a critical part. I'm going to bring up one of the older models that I had. Let's see here, structure. Yeah, so this was an example of that, what I developed to be kind of my own version control system here for the progress of a model. So, starting out with O1 and then labeling it with its own iteration. And then in some instances, I would, if there was a crash or some issue, I would just identify that, one instance here specifically for testing out UVs, one for testing out masses, things like that. So I just tried to find a way of keeping track of version control within the Maya environment. um, Backups. Even though I had this version control system in place, so in case something happened to a later version, I could go back to a previous iteration. There was always that concern that this was the folder structure and this was being saved somewhere, and if something were to happen to this location, where could I recoup that data? So what I ended up doing was structuring this in a OneDrive folder structure. This is just what I had available as part of the course. So I made sure all of this was being saved on OneDrive and being backed up at least daily. But then I also had a backup to that OneDrive. So I synced a Google Drive uh, to read basically everything within OneDrive. So even though I had everything in OneDrive, I had it backed up to Google Drive as well. And then after major milestones like a midterm and then final, I would actually back it up, all this data into a hard drive, an external hard drive. So it was just something I had experienced before where loss of information it becomes a huge challenge. And so this way, if anything were to happen, I could always rely on one or two different backup systems. And the key to these were that it was automated, so it would sync automatically. Uh, daily, and so that would be one less thing for me to have to think about to make sure that it was being backed up. There were a few instances where it did encounter an error, namely because the file name started to get really long, and so that a lot of it had to do with the file naming convention that I created. So I just had to go back and revise it to make sure that the file names weren't too long that either OneDrive or Google Drive can handle it. Um, let's see here. I also wanted to highlight in Unreal, because this is ultimately where everything ended up being sorted into, is that within Unreal, the folder structure here uh, was developed in such a way that to categorize assets, meshes, being used in the environment. And so I isolated those, but then I also isolated materials uh, in the case of, let's say a master material, but then the material instances for each of the different types. So landscapes and hero assets, each would have its own material instance that would read from the master file. So keeping track of that became really important. There were other parts like the cinematics. So I had some post processes that I tested out. They only had one sequence main. But there were some post processes that I wanted to isolate, and then of course in the world outliner, that was another critical area where I wanted to kind of keep things in order. So I had a folder structure for foliage assets, hero assets, and so forth. Um, and then even within each, because there were so many, quite a few instances of several of them, I created several subsets of each, and that way it would be easy to select and move and isolate, and then isolating lighting and render effects and so forth. So throughout this whole process, keeping track of files within the production pipeline, but then also through the Unreal environment became a really critical part of the process. Streamlining, not just going from Maya to Unreal was dependent on that. And so as I started integrating other tools like Mudbox and Substance Painter and so forth, it became really important to keep track of files. And so as I took a model from um, Maya into either Mudbox or ZBrush for developing the high poly version. That was kind of the next step of that production pipeline, keeping track of that information. So if we go to, let's see here, an example would be under the gate asset, I have a Marmoset file dedicated just for Marmoset, one for Substance Painter, and if there were other tools like ZBrush instead of Mudbox, then it would have its own as well. I also tested out or utilized a few other tools in my production pipeline. World Creator for the landscape, Affinity Photo, and Substance bitmap to material, uh, as well as a little bit of Substance Designer. So those tools were really important. Just to highlight them real quickly, Mudbox, I use that for generating the high poly version of a model. So I would take the FBX file, the low poly version from Maya, bring that into Mudbox or ZBrush. I found both to be really good tools. Mudbox seemed to be, at least for me, much quicker for certain tools like using the stencil or stamps, and then just kind of overlaying it and painting basically or sculpting over a subdivided low poly version. But that became a really great part of the production pipeline because I would be able to, in this case here, take that low poly version of the model. Here's the low poly version or the high poly version of it. I would export this and then take it into a tool like Substance Painter where I could bake the high poly onto the low poly. And then I used Marmoset. mostly as a quick tool before bringing stuff into um, Unreal. And so by having a quick render of the materials on the asset, I'd be able to render them quickly in real time. And then basically, either generate renderings for my model sheets, or again, just to test it before I would integrate it into Unreal. So I found that to be a really quick way of documenting things, testing things out before they went into Unreal. Plus, it also gave me a chance to test to utilize this tool, which I found to be really great. Um, as with all of these tools, the learning process was a big part of it. I tried out a few other tools along the way, in collaborating with some of my colleagues, and some of them were, for example, like XNormal, Keyshot, and although they were really great tools, for whatever reason, either I couldn't afford it at that moment, or um, I found something else that seemed to work a little bit better with my pipeline. I ended up choosing some tools over others. But what it did make me realize is that there are so many tools that are out there as part of this game environment development pipeline, that it's not so much focusing on the tool itself and learning everything about it, but it's about understanding the concepts. And by understanding the concepts of, say, for example, like low poly model generation in Maya, 3D Studio, and Blender, and so forth, you can take that process and apply it to really any tool. And so you'd be going through, the low poly version, the high poly version, baking it using, any number of tools, and then generating the materials from it. So understanding those concepts became important for me, rather than just solely focusing on Maya and understanding every single aspect of it. Although that was part of the process, but I think by focusing on the concepts, I feel comfortable going into any other 3D modeling tool or baking tool and material development tool, and using that same process with just a quick understanding of that particular tool. I can apply the concepts really quickly. And of course, learning from my colleagues was an important part. There's different perspectives, different ways of doing the same tasks. And so in my trial and error, I was able to find my own ways of developing an effective production pipeline, while other students developed others. Um, so ultimately, trying to get an environment generated in Unreal was a really big task because of all the documentation. And so I've always found note taking and documentation to be a critical part of this process as well. So although it does take time, I value setting aside time to document it in the same way that I'm documenting this video, and notes generated from it. What I would end up basically doing is, whether it was YouTube videos or learning from colleagues or just trial and error, is documenting different processes. So I use Evernote, and I found that to be a really good digital way of taking notes, screen captures, videos, and so forth. So in this example here, I was guided by my colleagues in my class to refine the edge of the water that I had applied to my scene, and using the depth fade node in Unreal 4. So without any familiarity, I kind of researched it, found a YouTube video for it, and then started documenting it in a way that I could quickly understand it, and then go back to it later on when I needed to. Because that's one thing I've found, is that a process like this that isn't being used on a regular basis, you end up needing to go back to it and basically relearning it. So rather than going through that research phase and trying to find, okay, where is that information and so forth, I can do a quick search in my notes, and I've got the process basically, step for step. Okay, here's what you need to do. You need to revise this portion, make it look like this, and then make that variation in the parameters, and then basically get to the effect that you want to. So the documentation part of it, I found to be really critical on certain tasks, like for example, modeling in Maya, low poly and then high poly, and then going through all that process, repetitive tasks. I feel like those become ingrained much quicker. But then some of these tasks in which you only really need to do once or twice in the course of a project, those are worth documenting in some form or fashion. So I really took advantage of that, and I value that a lot. And I think those are going to help me later on, in those instances where I need to recall that information quickly. So that wraps up this what I'm going to call the first part of the postmortem, as far as an overview of the production pipeline and the organization system. But then in the next part, I'm going to go into documenting some greater detail of basically the Unreal environment, and then some of the nuances and some of the challenges that I found, as well as some of the tips that hopefully can help others, as well as for myself later on when I develop other future projects. So that will wrap up this first part.